Tax collection worked very differently compared to modern day. Today, most tax is collected at the end of the tax year. But in Rome, they could not wait a year to collect taxes. Sometimes, wars sprung up, and Rome needed cash immediately. So Rome came up with a simple yet profitable system that allowed taxes to be collected immediately for Rome, allowing the Romans to conduct wars or major public works. And it started with the Publicani. They were like the corporate hedge funds of ancient Rome, and they collected taxes all across the empire, but not for Rome. They collected tax for themselves. The Roman Empire was divided into regions and were auctioned off by the censors. These auctions took place in an auction block in the Roman Forum, specifically near the temple of Castor and Pollux. However, the land itself was not for auction. What was for auction was the right to collect tax. The Publicani were the organizations who collected taxes, and they formed societates. No single person was rich enough to purchase the rights to collect tax, so groups of Romans would come together to form the societates. They had CEOs, the manceps, shareholders, the socii, and managers, the magistri. The auctioneers would estimate the tax revenue that a province would generate, and rights to tax collection would go to the highest bidder for 5 years. Once purchased, any tax collected above the bidding price was pure profit for the Publicani. It was a great system. It allowed the Roman state to immediately receive funds, and the Publicani were able to profit. However, if an unforeseen event occurred in the purchased province, reducing revenues, the Publicani risked collecting less tax than the bidding price, a risk that most Publicani companies were willing to take. This system was great and worked in theory, but in practice, it soon became consumed in corruption and mismanagement. Because the Publicani had already paid the state, many governors turned a blind eye to the method of collection. As taxes collected above the bidding price was pure profit, this incentivized the Publicani organizations to be as ruthless as possible. If a city was unable to pay its tax bill, the Publicani would lend them the money to pay, with an added catch. The interest on the loan was extortionate, sometimes as high as 48%. Many cities fell into a debt spiral, resulting in whole cities effectively becoming slaves to the Publicani. However, that was not the only trick the societates organizations had. In Roman law, there was no limited liability. If a Roman business went bankrupt, the owner owed all the debts that business had. The owner could lose any land and houses he owned, along with his reputation. But the loophole? The CEO of the societates was often a highly educated Roman slave who was given a peculium. This was an investment by the real owners of the societates for the day-to-day running of the business. The Roman slave would sign any contracts, and if the company came into any trouble, legally, a master was only liable for the debts of the Roman slave up to the value of the peculium, effectively reducing the risk factor significantly, becoming the Roman equivalent to a modern-day shell company. But that's not the worst loophole the societates found. By law, senators were forbidden to engage in large-scale trading or banking. The senators were supposed to be above money. Instead, senators would secretly invest their wealth in many Publicani companies as silent partners. In exchange, the senators, who decided what wars to fight and which provinces to tax, would steer contracts towards their chosen Publicani. It created a loop where the senators deciding on war were financially incentivized to make those wars as profitable as possible for the Publicani companies. Soon, most of the Senate was under the control of Publicani companies. But this soon had to change, and change eventually came under the Emperor Augustus. Emperor Augustus was the first emperor of Rome, and to secure his power, he needed to secure the empire's finances. However, the Publicani companies effectively had a monopoly on the market. They knew roughly how much a province could generate, whereas the Senate had little idea. They could bid low and profit hugely. So, to combat this, Augustus issued an empire-wide data collection project, known as the Census. Augustus sent agents to measure every field, count every head, and assess every asset, to determine how much each province could generate. Once the census was complete, the Publicani company's margins were slashed overnight. Secondly, Augustus employed new tax collectors called procurators. Unlike the Publicanus, the procurators were not incentivized to steal. They were paid a fixed salary instead. If they were caught stealing, the punishment was ruin or death. These procurators reported directly to Emperor Augustus, completely bypassing the Senate. Politicians could no longer touch the tax revenues. Instead, the emperor had complete control over tax. By removing the profit motive, Augustus made tax collection fairer, but slower. But removing one problem gave rise to new problems. Because the system was now centralized, if an emperor was bad with money, the entire empire suffered, not just one province. Which system do you think was better for Rome?